cruel stepdad locked his paralyzed daughter in a room with a vicious dog. But the ending was nothing he expected. The wind howled through the cracks of the old farmhouse as the last of the sun vanished behind the hills. Inside, the room stood silent and cold, each one emptier than the last. In the far corner, down a forgotten hallway, 11-year-old Ava lay curled beneath a thin blanket on a mattress on the floor. 6 months had passed since the car crash that left her paralyzed and took her mother's life. Everything changed after that. Her mother had been her warmth, her song at bedtime, her entire world. In her place now was Raymond Carver. Ray, the man her mother had once trusted, but who now treated Ava like a burden too heavy to bear. He never spoke her name gently, never met her eyes without disdain. Ava's room had no wheelchair. She crawled to reach the portable toilet in the corner. There were no toys, no television. Meals were shoved in on a tray by Ray's boot. The only thing she still had from before was a tiny music box her mother had given her, but its winder had broken, and it no longer sang. That night, Ray came home drunk. His boots pounded unevenly through the hallway, his voice slurring curses into the air. Then, silence. The back door creaked open. Minutes later, he returned, dragging a thick iron chain. "Time to clean the slate," he muttered. Brutus had arrived 2 weeks earlier. A large German shepherd with scars on his flanks and a permanent snarl etched into his face. Ray claimed the dog was ex-military, discharged after an incident that had left a man dead. He had adopted Brutus from a shady private kennel, grinning like he had found the solution to a problem. Brutus lived outside, chained to a wooden cage by the barn, fed on a strict schedule. Ray never touched him without gloves. To the neighbors he had said, "This dog's exactly what this house needs." That night, Ray unlatched the back of the house and stormed toward Ava's door. She looked up, alarmed, as he grabbed her by the arm. She screamed, but no one heard. He dragged her outside through the cold night, across the yard to the old equipment shed. It smelled of rust and damp earth. In the corner, Brutus waited, unchained. His eyes gleamed in the darkness. Ray tossed Ava to the floor. "There," he said with a sneer. "Let nature take its course." He slammed the door behind him. Ava sobbed as she scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the floor, her legs lifeless. Brutus rose to his full height, his teeth bared. A deep growl rumbled from his chest. Outside, Ray stopped to listen for a moment, then smiled to himself. He walked away, the sound of his truck fading into the distance. Inside the shed, silence settled. Except for the growl of the beast just feet away, Ava curled herself tighter against the cold floor, heart pounding as Brutus remained motionless across the dim shed. His growl, at first low and menacing, began to fade. He stood still, head slightly lowered, his body tense, yet not advancing. The seconds stretched like hours. She buried her face in her arms and wept, not just from fear, but from exhaustion. Her thin frame trembled with each sob, every breath short and ragged. She could not move her legs, but she tried to inch away, pushing herself back with her palms, scraping her elbows raw against the concrete. Brutus did not follow. Instead, the massive dog slowly lowered himself to the ground. He rested his chin on his paws, but kept his eyes locked on her. They were not wild, not angry, just watching. A sudden rumble broke the silence. Ava froze. It was her stomach. The hollow ache inside her had been growing all evening. Now it spoke up with an audible growl. She glanced at the dog, wide-eyed. Brutus lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then, in the quiet, his own stomach answered, a deep, long groan from within the beast. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ava, with eyes still red from crying, let out the smallest of laughs. It escaped her lips like something uninvited, a sound she had not made in weeks, a laugh, cracked and hoarse. "We're both hungry," she whispered. To her shock, Brutus's jaw parted slightly. He did not growl. His tongue poked out and curled at the edge of his mouth. He looked relaxed somehow, as if, in that brief moment, he was sharing the same joke. She stared back at him. "You look like you're smiling," she murmured. He stayed where he was, unmoving, but no longer a threat. There was something behind his eyes now, something she could not explain but could feel. A stillness, a sadness, maybe recognition. Slowly, Brutus began to crawl forward. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Her hand tightened around the only thing she had managed to bring from her room, her mother's old plastic keychain toy. A cracked, worn ladybug that no longer lit up. Her mother used to hang it from the rearview mirror. After the crash, Ava had begged to keep it. Now, it was all she had. Brutus approached. Inches away, he stopped. He sniffed once, low and long, then sat in front of her, lowering his massive head. His nose nudged her hand. Then gently, he licked her knuckles. She did not move, could not. Her body was frozen, but her heart did not race this time. Her fear was not paralyzing. She looked down at the dog. "My mom used to say," she whispered, "a good dog always looks into your eyes before doing anything. That's how you know." Brutus lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers. He was looking, truly looking. She felt it, saw it. Then, as if called by something inside, Brutus turned away. He walked across the shed to the far wall, sniffing the baseboards, pawing at the corner. His claws scraped wood. Ava turned her head to see. There, behind some stacked crates, a panel of rotted wood gave a little under his weight. Brutus began to claw harder. Ava's breath came quicker. "You're trying to get out," she said softly. She dragged herself toward him, biting her lip against the pain in her arms as she pulled herself closer. Her fingers found the edge of the panel. She yanked, twisted, pulled at the old nails until they bent and broke. Splinters tore into her palms, but she kept going. Brutus pushed his weight again and again until finally the board cracked. A hole opened just large enough for him to squeeze through. With one last look at Ava, Brutus pushed himself into the gap and disappeared into the night. Brutus hit the dirt path like a shadow on fire, paws pounding against gravel as he bolted from the property into the thick of night. His breath came in hard bursts, each stride driven by something more than instinct, something deeper, older, a promise. The countryside was quiet under a slivered moon, the kind of silence that could swallow cries for help. But Brutus ran as if the air itself could carry his urgency. About 2 miles down the road, a delivery van had stopped at a side barn to drop off feed. Its headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the outline of a large, filthy dog barreling down the lane. The driver, startled, stepped out and instinctively raised his arms. "Whoa! Hey! Back off!" Brutus did not flinch. He skidded to a halt and began barking, sharp and insistent, his claws scraping the side of the van. He leapt, not with aggression but with desperation, trying to be understood. A woman in her 60s, bundled in a thick coat, emerged from her nearby porch. "Is that a shepherd?" she called out. "Looks like it's been through a war." The driver shook his head. "Crazy mutt nearly jumped into my truck." Then, from behind the woman's skirt, a boy of about 10 stepped forward. He had wide brown eyes and wore striped pajamas and rubber boots. "Wait," the boy said, watching the dog bark and whirl. "I think he's trying to say something." The woman frowned. "Jamie, get back." But Jamie did not move. He watched the dog tilting his head, then turned to the others. "Follow him," he said simply. "He's not trying to scare us. He's trying to get us to follow." They hesitated, but when Brutus dashed back down the road, barking once over his shoulder, Jamie took the first step. Within minutes, a group of 4, Jamie, the woman, the delivery driver, and a local farmhand, were packed into the van and trailing the strange dog. Brutus led them, not with fear, but with purpose, never once looking back until they reached the edge of the property. He stopped at the shed. He snarled low, his entire body pressed against the door. He pawed violently at the wood, letting out a sharp, piercing bark. "Something's in there," Jamie whispered. The woman moved forward, calling out, "Hello? Anyone in there?" Nothing. Then they heard it. A faint noise, a soft thump. The driver grabbed a crowbar from the van and pried at the lock. It gave after a struggle. The door creaked open. There, crumpled on the ground, lay Ava. Her face was pale and smeared with grime, her arms curled tightly around her chest. In one hand she still clutched a worn plastic ladybug toy. "Oh, dear God!" the woman gasped, rushing in with a blanket. "She's ice cold." Jamie stepped forward slowly, eyes wide with something like awe as he looked from the girl to the dog. "She's alive," the driver murmured, lifting her carefully. "But barely." At that moment, headlights swept across the driveway. Ray had returned. He stumbled out of his truck, reeking of alcohol, and stopped when he saw the van, the strangers, and the dog. "Oh, what the hell?" Before he could finish, Brutus let out a snarl unlike anything the others had heard before. He charged forward, stopping just inches from Ray, hackles raised, teeth bared, placing himself squarely between the man and Ava. "Back!" the driver shouted, but the woman raised a hand. "No, he is protecting her." Ray tried to play it off, chuckling nervously. "I don't know what you think you saw, but that girl, she gets into things. Always been a handful, that one." But his voice faltered. His words contradicted earlier statements. When the police arrived minutes later, summoned by the farmhand, Brutus refused to move from Ava's side. The officers took one look at the dog, the girl, and the group of witnesses, and made their decision. Ray was handcuffed on the spot, charged with child endangerment, neglect, and attempted harm to a minor. Brutus never growled again that night. He just sat by Ava as the ambulance arrived, his breathing calm, his watchful eyes never leaving her. The story spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, news outlets were running headlines that read, "Hero dog breaks free to save disabled girl from abuse," and "Brutus the Brave, shepherd turns on abuser, protects innocent child." Photos of the large German shepherd sitting beside the hospital bed of a frail, sleeping girl circulated on television and across social media. But the image that gripped the nation most was not one of violence or drama. It was of loyalty. Ava woke in the hospital 2 days after being rescued. Her body was weak, her skin still pale, and the intravenous line ran from her arm like a thread tying her to the world. Nurses leaned over her gently, murmuring reassurance, but she said nothing, until she opened her mouth and whispered one word. "Brutus?" A social worker called the shelter that had taken the dog in. An hour later, Brutus was escorted into the pediatric recovery wing by an officer who had seen it all. His steps were careful, deliberate, as if he understood the gravity of the space. As soon as he entered Ava's room, her eyes lit up for the first time since the accident. She reached out, voice cracking as she said again, louder this time, "Brutus." The dog pressed his massive head into her chest, and she threw her arms around his neck. She did not cry softly. She sobbed, tears that sounded like the breaking of walls and the mending of something deeper. Nurses looked away with misted eyes. The therapist in the corner simply nodded. She had seen breakthroughs before, but never quite like this. Over the next few days, Brutus visited Ava regularly. Doctors noticed her vitals improve when he was present. She ate more, slept better. But beyond her recovery, Brutus's story was gaining attention for another reason. A team of animal welfare investigators dug into the shepherd's past. What they uncovered was a history of pain, fear, and neglect. Brutus had once been a military working dog, assigned to explosive detection in a conflict zone overseas. After a mission failure, not due to his error but a command oversight, he was pulled from active duty. When his unit disbanded, no one claimed him. That was when Ray stepped in. Records showed Ray had applied to adopt a retired military dog, but he did not do it for kindness. He did it for control. He attempted to retrain Brutus for private protection work using cruel methods: starvation, isolation, punishment for perceived disobedience. The animal that emerged was not violent by nature, but reactive and terrified. He never turned on anyone, one investigator remarked. He just stopped trusting. Until Ava. She was the first person who had not yelled, hit, or restrained him. She had not even expected him to be good. She had simply survived beside him. And that had been enough. With Ray in custody and his house seized for investigation, Ava was placed into the care of a privately funded rehabilitation center for children who had survived trauma. The program, backed by an animal welfare foundation, emphasized recovery through the presence of therapy animals. Ava was allowed to choose her companion. She chose Brutus. The dog who had once been locked in a shed with her now slept beside her bed at night, stood guard during therapy sessions, and helped other children learn to trust again. Brutus remained calm around wheelchairs, crutches, and even loud noises. His presence said what no adult could: "You are safe now." The children called him the door dog, the one who stood between them and what had once hurt them. But Ava called him something simpler: my friend. And Brutus, tail thumping softly on the floor every time she entered the room, never left her side. 1 year later, the city park overflowed with people. Parents, children, journalists, police officers, and volunteers filled the green space, all gathered beneath a banner that read, "Honoring Brutus, Guardian Dog." At the center of the event stood a small stage, modestly decorated, where a young girl slowly made her way forward with the help of a walker. Ava had grown stronger. Her legs still trembled with every step, but she no longer sat hidden in shadows. Her hair was tied back with a pale blue ribbon, and a soft breeze brushed against her cheeks as she reached the microphone. Brutus walked beside her, calm and steady, like a living statue of devotion. The crowd fell silent. She looked out at the sea of faces, some tearful, some smiling, all waiting, and then turned to look at Brutus, who sat beside her like he had done in that hospital room, that courtroom, that long dark night. She placed a hand on his broad head and began to speak. "He was never the monster in the cage," Ava said, her voice quiet but clear. "He was locked up, just like me. We saved each other." There was no need to explain further. Applause broke across the crowd like a gentle wave, not thunderous but warm. People clapped with hands pressed over their hearts. Some wept openly. Nearby, reporters recorded every word. That day, a new initiative was born. The nonprofit organization Second Chance Paws was officially launched, with the mission of rescuing and retraining dogs once labeled dangerous and pairing them with children who had experienced trauma. The idea was simple but radical: healing those who had been broken by fear. Together, Brutus was the face of the organization. His image, now gently smiling and proud, appeared on the logo above the name, and Ava, despite her age, was named the youngest ambassador in the organization's history. She stood not as a symbol of survival, but of transformation. "He gave me more than safety," she told a local news crew. "He gave me a reason to try again." As the ceremony drew to a close, music played and families lingered in the park, many approaching Ava to thank her, to meet Brutus, or to share their own story. But after the crowds thinned and the reporters packed up their cameras, Ava stepped away quietly with Brutus. She walked slowly across the field to a small hill beneath a cluster of trees. There she lowered herself onto the soft grass. Her walker stood beside her like a sentinel. Brutus curled up beside her, his head resting on her thigh. Her fingers traced his fur absently, not needing words. The sun dipped lower in the sky. A little boy, no older than 6, pale and withdrawn, stood hesitantly a few yards away, clutching a blanket. He had been recently brought into the hospital support program, silent and scared since the night his home caught fire. He watched Ava and the dog from behind the sleeve of his coat. Ava noticed him and smiled. She nodded slowly. Brutus lifted his head. With no command, no gesture, the dog stood, turned, and approached the boy slowly. He stopped a foot away, lay down, and waited. The boy knelt. Then, after a long pause, he reached out a hand. Brutus did not move. He just waited, and in that stillness, where no one spoke, where healing did not need to shout, something passed between the boy and the dog, something fragile, precious, and impossibly real. It was not a miracle. It was something better. It was trust. And it began, once again, with a moment of silence beside a girl who once shared a cage with fear, and a dog who chose to protect rather than destroy. Together, they had rewritten what it meant to be saved. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of courage, compassion, and second chances. Ava and Brutus reminded us all that sometimes healing does not come with noise. It comes with quiet understanding, steady presence, and love that asks for nothing in return. If this story touched your heart, imagine the stories still waiting to be told. At Amazing Paws Stories, we bring you the most powerful, true, and inspired tales of animals and the humans whose lives they change forever. Subscribe now to never miss a moment that might just change your day or your heart. Until next time, remember, every paw print has a story. Let us keep listening. Let us keep believing.
I always tell people that life's turning points rarely arrive with fanfare. They sneak in, tucked inside ordinary moments, and if you're not paying attention, you might just walk past them. That morning in Flagstaff, I wasn't looking for anything unusual. I'd parked my little blue truck at the edge of the farmer's market lot, stretched my legs and grabbed my usual tote. The sun was just climbing above the San Francisco peaks, turning the air gold, and the smell of cinnamon rolls drifted from a nearby store. My mind was on groceries, fresh tomatoes, a loaf of sourdough, maybe a jar of local honey. I moved slowly from booth to booth, greeting vendors by name, feeling that gentle comfort of small-town routine. The last thing I expected was to find a wild animal waiting for me between the bread and the apples. I'd just finished chatting with an elderly vendor about her homemade apple butter when I wheeled my cart toward the truck. That's when I noticed a slight shift in the grocery bags. At first, I thought a bag had tipped over, but as I got closer, I saw a tuft of fur, matted and dust-covered, rising and falling with the tiniest breath. Then the eyes opened sharp amber green and far too wild to belong to any house cat I'd ever met. My mind froze for a second. Not because I didn't know what I was looking at, but because the reality of it hit hard. A bobcat kitten, no bigger than a loaf of bread, curled in the shade of my canvas tote. In those first seconds, instinct took over. I set the cart brake, crouched low, and tried to make myself small. She didn't run, didn't hiss, just watched me with a calm that was somehow more unnerving than fear. Her breathing was shallow, her ears tipped forward. I remembered something George, a retired park ranger in our town, once told me. A wild cat will let you know whether you're a threat in the first 3 seconds. I counted those seconds in my head, my eyes never leaving hers. She didn't move. This wasn't like stumbling on a lost puppy or even a stray kitten from someone's barn. Bobcat kittens aren't meant to be in parking lots. They're born in dens tucked deep into the forest, guarded fiercely by mothers who rarely let them out of sight. To see one here alone in the middle of asphalt and weekend chatter meant something had gone wrong. My first thought was that her mother might be nearby, but a slow scan of the lot and surrounding fields showed nothing. The hum of engines, the chatter of shoppers, the clang of metal carts. None of it belonged to her world. A woman in a green cardigan stopped a few feet away, her paper grocery bag balanced on her hip. "Is that—" She began leaning forward slightly. "I think so," I whispered back. She nodded once, understanding without words, and moved on as if to give me space to decide what would happen next. That's something about living in a small community. You learn to read the moment to step back when it's not yours to step into. In my head, a checklist began to form. Step 1, don't startle her. Step 2, assess for injury. Step 3, decide if this is a call to rehab situation or immediate intervention. My training was hardly formal. I'd volunteered with domestic animal rescues, read up on wildlife safety, and listened to countless stories from folks like George. But I knew enough to recognize dehydration and stress when I saw it. Her fur was dusty, her paws scraped, and she had that hollow look that told me she hadn't eaten in a while. A real-life memory flashed into my mind years ago. I'd been part of a small group that helped rescue an injured hawk from the roadside. We'd called the licensed rehabber, kept the bird calm, and followed every instruction to the letter. The hawk had survived because someone acted quickly, but also correctly. That lesson that timing matters, but so does doing it right, came rushing back. I slowly reached into the cart for the loaf of bread, sliding it out from under her. She shifted, but didn't bolt. I grabbed the old flannel shirt I kept in my tote, and moving slow enough for her to follow every motion, draped it loosely over her small body. She tensed once, then stilled. With careful hands, I lifted her, feeling the surprising weight of such a small creature, and held her against my chest. There's a strange stillness in moments like that. Your body is alert, every muscle aware of the sharp claws just under your fingers, yet there's also a deep, quiet clarity. I wasn't thinking about my grocery list anymore. I wasn't thinking about the time. I was thinking about how a bobcat kitten, probably no more than 8 weeks old, had crossed an invisible boundary between the wild and human worlds, and somehow landed in mine. The small lesson I took from that moment is one I've carried ever since. You don't get to choose when you're called to act. You only get to choose how you respond. Most people think rescue work is about being ready, having the right equipment, the right contacts, the right plan. And yes, those things matter. But often it's about saying yes before you have the answers, trusting that you'll find the way forward once you start moving. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. If she was healthy enough, the right thing would be to get her to a licensed wildlife rehab center. If not, we'd need a vet who understood wildcats. Either way, my quiet Saturday had just become something else entirely. I could have called animal control right there, and part of me considered it. But there was something in her steady gaze that told me I needed to get her safe first, then make the calls. From the corner of my eye, I saw Martha the quilter making her way toward me. She didn't ask questions, just set down her bag and reached in for a small bottle of water. "For you." "Not her," she said softly, as if she knew I'd forgotten to breathe. Then she looked at the flannel-wrapped bundle in my arms. "Name her yet?" I shook my head. "Too soon." She smiled faintly. "You'll know when it's time." I settled the kitten into a sturdy box lined with my spare sweater and set it on the passenger seat of the truck. She sat there, still and watchful, as I loaded the groceries around her. Every so often, she'd glance at me, not with fear, but with something like calculation. I had the sense she was weighing me up just as much as I was assessing her. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced once more at the farmer's market behind me. People moved on with their day, the smell of roasted chiles in the air, kids laughing by the kettle corn stand. In another life, I might have stayed, wandered the stalls, enjoyed the morning. But in this one, a wild cat was riding home beside me, and nothing about the day would be the same. That was the morning everything shifted. I didn't know yet what role I was stepping into: rescuer, caretaker, temporary guardian, but I knew I'd been handed a responsibility. And whether it lasted a day, a week, or a lifetime, I intended to carry it well. I turned the key. The engine rumbled, and as we pulled out onto the 2-lane road leading toward the edge of town, the kitten blinked once, slow and deliberate. It felt like a signal, an unspoken truce. Somewhere ahead, decisions waited. But for now, we were simply two creatures traveling the same road. And that road was about to take us far from where either of us expected to be. Next came the choice that would set the tone for everything that followed, a choice between stepping back or stepping fully into her story. By the time I reached the edge of town, the easy choice was still sitting in the back of my mind. I could have pulled into the nearest veterinary clinic, handed over the box, and let someone else take responsibility. In truth, part of me wanted to. I was no stranger to animal rescue in the domestic sense: dogs, cats, the occasional abandoned rabbit, but a bobcat kitten was another world entirely. The thought of calling wildlife control and letting them handle it would have freed my afternoon, kept my hands clean, and preserved the safety of knowing I hadn't overstepped. And yet, when I glanced at her Juniper, though I didn't have her name yet watching me through the folded edge of the flannel, I knew I wouldn't be taking the easy route. Compassion, I've learned, is rarely convenient. It demands time when you don't have it, patience when you're tired, and trust when the outcome is anything but certain. I took the long road home instead of cutting through downtown, giving myself a few extra miles to think. Every turn of the wheel brought a new question. Was her mother still alive somewhere in the forest, searching for her? Had she been separated for hours or days? If I took her straight to a rehab center, would she get the attention she needed right away? Or would she be just another case in a busy season of rescues? It reminded me of a time years ago when I was hiking near Oak Creek and found an injured quail tangled in fishing line. I'd been on my way to meet friends already running late. The easy choice was to take a photo, call it in, and move on. The harder choice was to sit in the dirt for 40 minutes, coax the bird free, and carry it back to the trailhead where a park volunteer could take over. I chose the latter, missed my lunch, and went home with dust on my jeans, but that quail survived. The lesson stuck. Sometimes you are the only one standing in the gap between survival and loss. In Juniper's case, the gap was both literal and figurative. She'd crossed from wild ground into human space, and now I was the bridge. So I decided to make a short stop, not to pass her off, but to prepare. The Flagstaff feed store was just opening when I pulled in. I parked in the shade, left the engine running for warmth, and went inside. The clerk, a young man stacking hay bales, raised his eyebrows when I asked for a kitten milk replacer and a small animal heating pad. "You're bottle feeding?" he asked. Temporarily, I said, leaving it at that. Not everyone needs the full story in the first chapter. Back at the truck, I eased the box open. She shifted away from the light, tucking her nose under her paw. I could see the fine tremor in her sides, a mix of cold exhaustion and the sheer strangeness of her surroundings. I slid the heating pad under the sweater, set it to low, and closed the lid halfway to keep her calm. It wasn't much, but it was a start. There's a perspective I've gained over years of living near wild places. Wild animals don't see our help the way we see it. They don't understand rescue compassion or sanctuary. What they understand is safety, whether they have it or they don't. In that moment, my role wasn't to make her like me. It was to make her safe enough to survive the next few hours. I made the decision then to take her to my house before calling the rehab center. That choice wasn't without risk. Human contact can compromise a wildcat's chances of release, but leaving her cold and possibly dehydrated in a holding cage while paperwork shuffled through the system seemed worse. My plan was simple: stabilize, warm, hydrate, then transfer. Pulling into my driveway, I felt the weight of what I'd committed to. I carried the box inside, set it in the quietest corner of the guest room, and crouched beside it. Slowly, I opened the lid and let her see me without the barrier of cardboard. She didn't hiss, but her ears flattened slightly, a warning. I poured warm water into a shallow dish and slid it forward. After a moment, she leaned down, took a sip, then retreated to the sweater's fold. Small victories. That's when I knew her name. Juniper. It came as naturally as breathing pulled from the trees that ring the high desert, hardy and resilient in rough soil. The name felt like a promise not of ownership, but of care. With her settled, I made the call to the wildlife rehab center. A woman named Dana answered, her voice calm and steady. I explained the situation, approximate age, condition, location found. She agreed that immediate warmth and hydration were the priority and asked me to monitor her through the morning. "We're short-staffed today," she admitted. "If you can keep her stable, bring her this afternoon." The unspoken truth was clear. Sometimes volunteers had to shoulder more than they planned. That conversation confirmed what my instincts had been telling me. Juniper's best chance started right here in my quiet guest room with someone willing to watch her closely for the next several hours. That didn't make me a wildlife expert. It just meant I was willing to step in until the experts could take over. It struck me how often we think help only counts if it's permanent. But in animal rescue, as in life, temporary help can mean the difference between a safe outcome and a tragic one. We don't have to be the final chapter in someone's story to make our page matter. By midday, Juniper had taken a little formula from a bottle, curled tighter around the heating pad, and closed her eyes. I sat a few feet away, answering emails and sipping coffee, letting the soft rhythm of her breathing fill the room. Every so often, she'd shift-test the air with her nose and settle again. She didn't know me, didn't know where she was, but she was warmer, hydrated, and alive. That was enough for the moment. In the quiet, I thought about how many people pass by opportunities to help because the timing is wrong. I've done it myself. Looked away, told myself someone else would step in. But every rescue I've been part of, from that quail on the trail to this bobcat kitten in a grocery cart, has reminded me that the moment rarely waits. You either act or you don't. There's a humility in realizing you can't save every animal. But there's also responsibility in knowing you can save this one. Today. Now. By the time the sun dipped lower over the peaks, I was ready to move to the next step. Juniper had taken more formula, licked a few drops from her paw, and even shifted to face me without flattening her ears. The rehab center called to say they could accept her that evening, but warned that intake might be slow. I weighed my options. Part of me wanted to keep her longer to make sure she was strong enough to handle the stress. But I also knew that licensed care could give her what I couldn't: vaccinations, medical checks, proper diet for a wildcat's growth. As I prepared her box for the short drive, I thought about the strange balance between letting go and holding on in rescue work. Choosing compassion over convenience wasn't about keeping her. It was about making sure every choice I made served her best interest, not my comfort. When I carried her back to the truck, she blinked at the sudden light, then settled again. I had no idea what the next chapter would hold, whether she'd return to the wild or remain in human care, but I knew this. I'd made the choice to step in, and that choice had already changed us both. And in ways I couldn't yet see, it was about to change the shape of my days, my friendships, and the quiet rhythms of my life. Because once you say yes to one rescue, you never really stop looking for the next life in need. The next hours would bring new routines, unexpected lessons, and the beginning of a bond I hadn't planned for. What started as a stop in a parking lot was quickly becoming a crash course in trust, hers and me and mine, in the idea that sometimes the wild chooses you. When you bring a wild animal into your life, even for a short while, you imagine the story will stay between the two of you. You think of the long nights, the feedings, the watchful moments as something private. But with Juniper, the opposite happened. Within days, other people began to appear, not in a way that intruded, but in a way that wove themselves quietly into her story. It started with George Ramirez. I'd seen him around town before, tall, leaner man whose weathered ball cap seemed as much a part of him as his easy stride. He'd spent 30 years as a park ranger before retiring to a small cabin near the forest. Word travels fast in small communities, and by the end of my second day with Juniper, George was knocking at my door. "Heard you found yourself a guest," he said with a half smile. I stepped aside, and he crouched near the box where Juniper was curled. He didn't reach in, didn't speak to her, just watched. After a moment, he nodded as if confirming something only he could see. "She's young, but she's got spirit," he said. "Spirit's half the battle." George became my first teacher in bobcat behavior. Over cups of coffee at my kitchen table, he explained the importance of scent, how every blanket, every shirt I wore near her would become part of her mental map. He told me stories of wild cats he'd tracked through snow, how they circled back to watch him from the tree line, curious but cautious. Those stories became more than entertainment. They were clues about how to move around her, how to give her space without making her feel alone. A day later, Martha Collins reappeared. I'd met her briefly at the farmer's market, but now she was at my doorstep with a neatly folded bundle in her arms. "These should make her more comfortable," she said, handing me 2 hand-knit blankets. "Don't worry if she chews them. That's what they're for." Martha had raised cats for most of her life, though never a bobcat. Her experience wasn't in wildlife rescue, but in the quiet patience of day-to-day animal care. Knowing when to leave them be, when to coax them forward, and when to simply sit in the same room so they knew you were near. It struck me that neither George nor Martha had come with the urgency of people trying to fix a situation. They came to stand alongside it. That's different. In rescue work, there's often a rush. Get the animal stable, get it moved, get it to the right hands. But this was slower, more intentional. They weren't just helping Juniper, they were helping me hold the space around her. A real-life example of this kind of quiet support came years earlier when a friend of mine in Sedona took in an injured red fox. She had no experience with foxes, but within days, her porch became a gathering point for neighbors. One brought frozen chicken, another lent a kennel, a retired vet down the street stopped by with antiseptic spray. Nobody argued about who would take over. They each did a small thing, and together it added up to a survival story. That's what I was beginning to see here. One afternoon, George returned with a small bag of chicken pieces and a well-worn field guide to southwestern wildlife. He placed the book on my table. "Thought you might want to see what her life would have looked like without us," he said. Later that evening, as Juniper nibbled cautiously from the chicken in a shallow dish, I flipped through the guide. There were photos of wild bobcats stalking through mesquite, resting in rocky alcoves, raising kits in hollowed logs. It was a reminder that my guest room was never meant to be her world. My role was temporary, no matter how much of my heart she quietly claimed. Martha's contributions were softer, but no less valuable. She'd stop by in the evenings with tea for me, and sometimes nothing at all for Juniper except her calm presence. Once she sat in the corner knitting while I bottle-fed Juniper. "It's not just the animal you care for in a rescue," she said without looking up. "It's the person doing the caring. You have to make sure they don't run out of steam." I'd never thought of it that way. But she was right. Rescue work drains you in ways you don't notice until you're too tired to think straight. Her presence slowed me down enough to notice. The small lesson that kept surfacing was that connection isn't always about talking. Sometimes it's about shared quiet, about holding the same purpose in the same space. That purpose can link people who might never have crossed paths otherwise, a retired ranger, a lifelong knitter, and someone like me who just happened to be in the right place on the wrong day for a bobcat kitten. A fresh perspective formed in my mind when a wild animal crosses into human territory and needs help. The rescue isn't just about getting them back to their world. It's also about reminding us that we're part of a larger web human-animal environment where one tug on the line vibrates through all of it. Juniper's presence was tugging on more lines than I could count. Word of her spread quietly. Maggie Thompson, who lived 2 houses down, stopped me on the sidewalk one morning. "I hear you've got a wild little roommate," she said, her eyes bright. Maggie was a watercolor artist, and she asked if she could sketch Juniper from a distance. Nothing intrusive, just to capture her posture, her eyes. I agreed. And a week later, she returned with a delicate painting, Juniper curled on her blanket, one paw tucked under the faintest suggestion of alertness in her gaze. It wasn't just a picture. It was a moment preserved, a reminder of this fragile in-between time. With each new person, the circle around Juniper widened. George shared stories of past rescues with Maggie. Martha began knitting small nests for the rehab center to use with other orphaned animals. Maggie offered to donate prints of her painting to raise funds for the center. What began as my solitary responsibility had become a shared project without me even asking. This unexpected web of human connection did more than help Juniper, it shifted something in me. I'd been living quietly content with my routines, content to keep my life contained. But now, my front door opened more often. Conversations spilled over mugs of coffee. Hands reached in to pass blankets or jars the size of food, and laughter sometimes filled the guest room while Juniper watched from her corner. She might have been a wild animal, but she was also the reason a handful of neighbors started seeing each other, not just in passing, but in purpose. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen, George leafing through his field guide, Martha knitting, Maggie sketching, I realized that Juniper wasn't the only one being rehabilitated. We were in our own way becoming part of a healthier ecosystem too. Isolation had been easy, even comfortable, but connection was turning out to be necessary. There was a quiet mystery in how she did it. She never sought attention, never performed for the people who came. She simply existed, needing care, and that need drew people together. It made me think of something George said the first day he saw her: "Spirit's half the battle." I was starting to believe that spirit can be contagious, moving through a community in ways you can't measure. The days ahead would bring challenges, a moment when that fragile trust between Juniper and me would be tested, and when the little network we'd built would have to pull tighter. But sitting there that night, listening to the click of knitting needles and the soft rustle of pages, I understood that I wasn't carrying this alone anymore. And when the test came on a night when the wind rose and the back door stood open, I'd be grateful for every person who had quietly stepped into her story alongside me. That moment, the one where connection would be the difference between losing her and bringing her home, was closer than I knew. It happened on one of those evenings that feels harmless. Quiet air, a low sky, the smell of rain far off. I'd been in the kitchen rinsing dishes while Juniper napped in the guest room. George had stopped by earlier with fresh chicken. Martha had left a new knitted mat, and the house felt steady. Then, sometime between stacking the plates and wiping the counter, the back door eased open. I didn't hear it over the sound of the faucet. When I stepped into the hallway, her box was empty. At first, I thought she'd tucked herself into the sweater folds. I crouched, checked corners, lifted blankets. Nothing. That's when I noticed the faint draft. The door cracked wide enough for a small wildcat to slip through. The first minutes of a search are a blur. I grabbed the flashlight, called George, and headed outside. The air was heavy with that just before rain stillness. The yard was fenced, but I knew a bobcat kitten could scale a barrier if fear or curiosity pushed her hard enough. I checked under the truck behind the stacked firewood along the line of juniper bushes. My beam caught only shadows. George arrived within 15 minutes, boots already damp from cutting through the grass. "She'll be close," he said, scanning the ground. We looked for paw prints, though the packed dirt made it hard to read. He moved slowly, pausing often like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. Martha appeared not long after, a flashlight in one hand and a small container of cooked chicken in the other. "Smell might help," she said. We set the pieces out in shallow dishes along the fence line. The three of us fanned out, keeping each other in sight. Here's the thing about searching for a missing animal. Especially a wild one, you have to fight your own panic. Panic makes you loud, clumsy, desperate. Wild animals read that energy and keep their distance. So I forced myself to slow down, to speak softly into the dark, using her name the way I did when offering food. Hours passed. The rain finally came, light at first, then heavier. My jacket clung to my shoulders, the flashlight beam catching raindrops like silver threads. I thought of a story Maggie once told me about her rescue cat slipping out during a winter storm. She'd walked the block for 3 nights straight before finding him under a neighbor's porch. The hardest part, she'd said, is not knowing if they're hiding or if they're gone. That was exactly where my mind wanted to go, to the worst-case scenarios. But I held to the small lesson I'd learned from previous rescues. You can't search for an animal you've already decided you've lost. You have to search for the one who's still alive, still close, still reachable. We worked in loops, circling back to the yard every 20 minutes in case she returned on her own. George pointed out a faint trail of disturbed leaves heading toward the tree line. We followed it until the rain erased the signs. It was nearing midnight when I finally sat on the back steps, soaked and tired, a flashlight in my lap. That's when Maggie arrived, her hair plastered from the rain, carrying a small battery lantern. She didn't say much, just took a seat beside me. "We'll find her," she murmured. 4 people now, each with a light, each walking the property in slow sweeps. The neighborhood had gone quiet except for the rain, the occasional call of a night bird, and our soft voices calling her name. Around 1 in the morning, we regrouped inside to dry off. We set a box with blankets just inside the open back door, placed dishes of water and chicken beside it, and left the porch light low. "If she's moving nearby, she'll smell it," George said. Then we waited. Those hours were the longest of my life with her. Waiting is harder than walking. Every creak of the floor, every rattle of the window frame in the wind made me turn my head, listening for something that wasn't there. I tried to imagine what she was doing. Was she huddled under a bush, shivering, climbing a tree, moving along the fence, unsure how to get back? In the quiet, I thought of another rescue from years back, a friend's dog lost in the hills for 3 days. Volunteers had set out food stations, worn clothing, and even recorded the owner's voice to play on a loop in the search area. The dog came back at dawn on the 3rd day, thin but alive. That story reminded me that animals often find their way home when given the right cues and a chance to feel safe. By 3 a.m., exhaustion was setting in. George insisted I try to rest while he took a final loop with the flashlight. Martha brewed tea in the kitchen. Maggie sat near the back door, eyes on the yard. I lay on the couch, but sleep wouldn't come. Then, sometime close to 4, I heard the faintest scrape on the porch. Maggie's voice low but urgent. "She's here." I bolted upright. There she was, just beyond the open door, her fur slicked with rain, eyes wide. She hesitated at the threshold, then stepped toward the box with blankets. George eased the door closed behind her. She let me scoop her up, trembling but not resisting. Relief is too small a word for that moment. She smelled of wet earth and sage, her heart beat quick against my arm. I dried her gently with a towel, set her in her box, and watched as she curled tight, eyes half closing. The others stayed until they saw she was truly settled, then left in the dim light of early morning. The fresh perspective that came from that night was simple but sharp. Community matters most when control is lost. Alone, I might have found her, or I might not have. Together, we created enough presence, enough signals to guide her back. Juniper may not have understood our intentions, but she responded to the environment we built for her return. In rescue work, as in life, there's a fine line between holding on and letting come. That night taught me to create the conditions for return without forcing the outcome. By sunrise, Juniper was asleep, her breathing steady. I sat beside her with my tea, watching the first light catch on the wet grass outside. I knew the bond between us had shifted, not because she would trust me more, but because I now understood her capacity to survive on her own terms. It wouldn't be the last time her wildness would test my ability to balance care with freedom. The next chapter of our story would show me just how far that balance could stretch, and how one rescued bobcat kitten could change the rhythm of an entire neighborhood. After the night Juniper went missing, something shifted, not just in my house, but in the neighborhood. People who had once only waved from driveways or nodded at the post office began stopping to talk, asking for updates. It was as if that one wild bobcat kitten had pulled a hidden thread, and now connections were weaving in every direction. George started it without even meaning to. One Saturday morning at the farmer's market, I overheard him telling a vendor about Juniper's safe return. The vendor mentioned a pair of orphaned raccoon kits someone had found by the riverbank. Within hours, George had connected the finder to the local wildlife rehabilitation center. "Once you've done it once," he said to me later, "you start seeing where else you can help." That pattern repeated itself. Martha heard about a neighbor whose old barn was sheltering a stray mother cat and 4 kittens. She came by my house one afternoon with 2 bags of donated blankets. "These aren't just for Juniper," she said. "I figured the shelter could use them too." She didn't stop there. Within a week, she was knitting small nests for the rehab center, just like the one Juniper slept in when she first arrived. Maggie's part in this was more visual, but just as powerful. She asked if she could use her painting of Juniper for a small run of art prints to sell at the community craft fair. Every dollar went to the rehab center's winter fund for heating enclosures and buying formula. She even set up a table with information about wild cat conservation, showing side-by-side images of domestic kittens and bobcat kittens so people could see the differences in their needs and behavior. Watching parents and children stop to ask questions felt like a quiet victory. I realized that what was happening around Juniper wasn't just about her. She'd become a kind of catalyst. People saw her story, even in fragments, and began thinking about the animals in their own corners of the world. Barn cats, injured birds, a turtle crossing a busy road. Helping became less of an abstract idea and more of a shared responsibility. A real-life example cemented that for me. One rainy afternoon, a teenager from down the street knocked on my door, holding a shoebox. Inside was a tiny, shivering squirrel. He'd remembered the night we searched for Juniper and said I didn't know what else to do, so I brought him here. We called the rehab center together, kept the squirrel warm, and arranged a pickup. It was such a small act, but I knew it had grown from seeing our community rally for a wild kitten. The small lesson was clear. Compassion is contagious. Once someone sees it in action, feels the impact firsthand, they're more likely to carry it forward. And that ripple effect doesn't need grand gestures. It grows from ordinary people making small, consistent choices to notice, to care, and to act. My fresh perspective came from watching the overlap between domestic animal rescue and wild animal rescue. I'd always thought of them as separate worlds, one about pets, the other about untamed lives. But the more I listened to George talk about foxes in the forest, or Martha share stories of bottle-feeding barn kittens, the more I saw the shared thread, the willingness to step into a life, however briefly, and leave it better than you found it. It wasn't long before our little group began thinking about ways to be more organized. George suggested a shared contact list for emergencies neighbors. The rehab center, a couple of retired vets, even the high school science teacher who volunteered with wildlife tracking. Maggie designed a simple flyer about what to do if you find an injured or orphaned animal, listing safe handling tips and numbers to call. We left copies at the library, the feed store, and the cafe downtown. What amazed me most was how these efforts didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a natural extension of what had already begun. People weren't just showing up for Juniper anymore. They were showing up for the idea that helping one creature matters, even if you'll never see it again. One evening, I was sitting on the porch with Juniper dozing nearby in her enclosure when George stopped by. He leaned on the railing, looking out at the yard. "Funny thing," he said. "I've been retired for years, thought I'd seen my last rescue. But she..." He nodded toward Juniper. "She reminded me why I started in the first place." I understood. She'd reminded me too. We didn't talk about it out loud, but all of us knew that Juniper's time with me was temporary. The rehab center's goal was to prepare her for a life back in the wild if possible. That knowledge didn't make our efforts feel smaller. It made them sharper. Every visit from a neighbor, every piece of advice from George, every blanket from Martha, every flyer Maggie handed out, they were all part of something bigger than keeping one bobcat kitten safe. They were about making it more likely that the next orphaned animal and the one after that would also have a network waiting. The air was starting to turn colder, the peaks catching snow when the rehab center called with an update. They were taking in more animals than usual this season. An early frost had disrupted food sources for small mammals. Could our group help collect supplies? Without hesitation, we spread the word. Within a week, the rehab center had more donated food, bedding, and cleaning supplies than they'd seen in months. I kept thinking back to the day I found Juniper in my shopping cart. I could never have guessed that moment would lead to a chain of small rescues, acts of generosity, and a renewed sense of connection in our town. She was still the same wary, beautiful creature, her wildness intact, but she'd somehow bridged the space between human and animal in a way I'd never seen before. The night after the supply run, I sat by her enclosure and told her about the raccoons, the barn kittens, the squirrel, the fox kit George had just helped transport. She blinked at me slow and steady, as if she knew she was part of something larger. Maybe she did. The next phase of her story and mine would bring changes I couldn't quite picture yet. Winter was coming, and with it decisions about her care, her readiness, and the fine line between keeping her safe and letting her go. And that line I was about to learn is where the hardest lessons live. By the time winter loosened its grip on Flagstaff Juniper and I had settled into a rhythm, it wasn't the same as living with a domestic cat. Her world was still defined by instinct, space, and boundaries, but it was steady. Mornings began with quiet observation from her enclosure, afternoons often brought supervised play in the yard, and evenings were for rest. What surprised me most was how the seasons around us seemed to shape her as much as the care I gave her. Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and new smells. I saw the shift in her first ears, swiveling toward the call of returning birds, nose twitching at the damp earth. George brought over a few sturdy logs for her to climb on, explaining that wild bobcats sharpen their hunting skills by exploring uneven terrain. Watching her stalk across those logs, crouching and leaping with silent precision, I was reminded she was only on loan to this human life. My role was to prepare her for the one waiting beyond my fence. That spring also brought a real-life moment that underscored the importance of adaptation. The rehab center called about an influx of orphaned jackrabbit kits after an early-season storm flooded several burrows. They needed extra hands. I volunteered for afternoon feedings, and it struck me how the staff's work mirrored what I was doing with Juniper, giving each animal what it needed in that specific moment of its life, knowing the care would have to change as the season did. Summer came with its own lessons. The days grew longer, and the air carried the scent of sun-warmed pine. Juniper became more active, testing the limits of her enclosure with bursts of speed. I added more enrichment, hanging feathers, hidden food puzzles, and shaded spots where she could watch the yard without being seen. Maggie, inspired by the colors of the season, painted a new piece of Juniper mid-leap, the blur of her coat against a background of green. She donated the print to the rehab center's summer fundraiser, which raised enough to repair 2 outdoor enclosures. The small lesson of summer was that growth often requires challenge. For Juniper, it was the physical challenge of new activities. For me, it was resisting the urge to keep her life too easy. A wild cat needs a measure of difficulty. It sharpens her mind, strengthens her body, and keeps her instincts alive. The same is true for people, though. We're not always as willing to embrace it. Autumn came quietly, a slow turning of leaves and cooler nights. The pace in town slowed too as tourists thinned out and locals settled into routines. Juniper's coat thickened, her movements grew more deliberate, almost economical. George and I began discussing the milestones she'd need to reach before any thought of release. Could she stalk and catch live prey? Did she startle easily at sudden noises? Was her wariness of humans intact enough to keep her safe? These were not casual questions. They were the kind that would determine the rest of her life. During one of those talks, George shared a story from years back about a bobcat he'd helped release into the forest. "You think you're ready to see them go," he said. "But nothing prepares you for the moment. They vanish into the trees. You just hope you gave them enough to make it." His words settled into me like the first frost, beautiful and heavy at the same time. Winter returned sooner than I expected. Snow fell in thick, quiet layers, and the world outside seemed to contract. Juniper adapted by slowing her pace, conserving energy, and curling into the warmest corner of her shelter. I adjusted to less outdoor enrichment, more focus on keeping her space dry and warm and making sure she had enough calories to handle the cold. That winter held a fresh perspective for me. I realized how much the rhythm of caring for a wild animal aligns you with the natural calendar. In spring, you prepare for growth. In summer, you encourage expansion. In autumn, you assess and conserve. In winter, you protect and endure. The seasons aren't just about weather. They're about readiness for whatever comes next. The community's involvement didn't fade with the cold. Martha brought over thickly knitted pads for the rehab center's smaller animals. Maggie painted winter scenes for a holiday auction. George helped install a better windbreak for Juniper's enclosure. Each action, like the changing light of the seasons, was part of the larger cycle, keeping her safe and moving forward. One late winter afternoon, while I was clearing snow from the path to her shelter, Juniper padded forward and stopped just a few feet from me. For a long moment, she held my gaze steady, unreadable. Then, with a flick of her ear, she turned and leapt onto the highest perch in her enclosure. Something about the movement told me she was testing not just herself, but me. Could I accept that she was moving closer to the day she might not need me? That was the quiet mystery of the seasons with her. Each one brought us closer to the point where my part of her story would end. I didn't know exactly when that would be, but I could feel it in the same way you sense the shift from autumn to winter. It's not marked by one day, but by a series of small, undeniable changes. As the snow began to melt and the patches of earth reappeared, I knew the next chapter would demand more than just care. It would ask for a decision, one that balanced her survival, her wildness, and the strange, unexpected bond we'd built. And like the seasons, that decision would come, whether I was ready or not. The first signs came quietly. Juniper began pacing her enclosure, more often pausing to watch the horizon instead of me. She ate well played when given the chance, but her focus was shifting outward. George noticed it too. "She's looking past you now," he said one afternoon as we sipped coffee by the fence. It wasn't a criticism, just an observation of what I already felt. She was ready for the life she was meant to live. The rehab center's coordinator, Dana, visited to assess her progress. She asked about Juniper's behavior. Was she wary of strangers, quick to hide, responsive to environmental changes? The answers were yes, yes, and yes. These were the traits that would give her the best chance in the wild. My heart was heavy, but I knew what this meant. The conversation about release could no longer be theoretical. I thought about a real-life example George had told me years earlier, a mountain lion cub he'd monitored from rescue to release. "It's not about whether you want to keep them," he said back then. "It's about whether keeping them is what's best for them." That truth had sounded simple until I found myself on the edge of living it. Dana explained the process. The release site would be deep within protected land, far from roads and human settlements. The trip would be short to minimize stress. Once there, the crate door would open, and the choice to step out would be Juniper's alone. I asked if I could be there. Dana smiled. "Yes. But remember, this isn't about a goodbye ceremony. It's about giving her the best start." The night before, I sat by her enclosure, longer than usual. I didn't talk much, just let her move as she pleased her steps soft on the straw. She climbed to her highest perch and looked out into the dark. I followed her gaze but saw only trees. It occurred to me that her world had always been larger than the space I gave her. My care had been a chapter, not the book. The morning was cold and still. George arrived early to help with loading. Martha came too, carrying one last knitted pad for the crate. Maggie stood off to the side, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. We worked without fuss, lowering the crate door, securing the latches, making sure she was calm. When I crouched to look in, she met my eyes for a heartbeat, then turned away. It was the most honest thing she could have done. At the release site, the air felt different, cleaner, sharper, alive with scents I couldn't name, but she surely could. Dana positioned the crate facing a slope that led into a dense stand of pines. We all stepped back. The door opened with a smooth swing. For a moment, she stayed inside, nostrils flaring. Then, with no glance back, she stepped out her paws, silent on the earth. She moved with purpose, weaving between trees until she vanished. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic pause at the edge of the forest. Just a quiet, decisive departure. And strangely, that was comforting. She didn't need us to see her off. She needed to go. The lesson in letting go, I realized, isn't about absence, it's about trust. Trusting that what you've given is enough. Trusting that the one you've cared for can now care for themselves. In wildlife rescue, this is the point you aim for from the start, even if your heart protests when it arrives. Knowledge comes in many forms, but this was a kind you can't get from books or training sessions. I learned that care is not ownership, and love does not require keeping. In fact, the truest form of both might be releasing someone, human or animal, back to where they belong. On the drive home, the truck was quiet. Martha folded her hands in her lap. George watched the road ahead. Maggie flipped through her sketchbook without drawing. We didn't need to talk. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the weight of what had just happened. Back at the house, the enclosure stood empty. I cleaned it slowly, each motion, part of a quiet ritual. I returned George's logs to his yard, packed away the feeding dishes, and folded the flannel shirt I'd wrapped her in that first day. There was sadness, yes, but also a steady sense of rightness. The story had moved where it was meant to go. A week later, Dana called. A motion-triggered camera had caught Juniper passing by a water source near the release site, healthy, alert, and moving strong. I closed my eyes and pictured her there, navigating a world that had always been hers. The fresh perspective that stays with me is this rescue isn't about holding on to the life you've touched. It's about ensuring that life has the freedom and tools to continue without you. And that's not just true for wild animals. It's true for friendships, for family, for anyone you've guided through a hard season. Sometimes your chapter ends so theirs can begin. If you've been part of a rescue of an animal, a person, even a part of yourself, you know that moment when you have to loosen your grip. It's never easy, but it can be the most loving choice you make. So here's my invitation. Think about where in your own life you might be holding on when it's time to trust and release. If Juniper's story has touched you, if it's made you see rescue animals, wildcats, or even your own relationships in a new way, I'd love for you to join this community. Like this video, subscribe for more stories, and share your own reflections in the comments. Who knows? Your story might be the one that inspires someone else to say yes when the wild unexpectedly chooses them.